The wedding hall glittered with lights and laughter, but beneath the music there was a sharp tension that only I seemed to notice, because from the moment my husband took my hand on that stage, his father-in-law's eyes had been burning holes through him, and when the speeches began, that man finally dropped his mask, tapping the microphone with a smug smile and saying, "Well, I suppose even an idiot can get lucky sometimes." And the room froze as a few people laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, while others stared at the floor. But my husband's hand tightened in mine, his knuckles white, because he had spent his whole life being underestimated, mocked for choosing honesty over shortcuts, humility over arrogance. And now, on the most important day of his life, he was being humiliated in front of everyone he loved, and I felt something inside me snap, because I knew this wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of power, a reminder that this man believed money and status made him superior. So when applause died down and silence fell, I gently took the microphone from the stunned MC, smiled politely, and said, "Thank you for your kind words," which earned a few confused chuckles before I continued, "You see, there's something about my husband that most people don't know, because he never thought it mattered." And at that moment his father-in-law's confident grin faltered, because he realized the room was listening, really listening, and I went on, my voice calm but steady. "Years ago, when your company was on the brink of collapse, when banks refused to take your calls and investors were walking away, there was an anonymous consultant who stepped in, restructured your debt, renegotiated your contracts, and saved thousands of jobs." And the color drained from that man's face as murmurs rippled through the guests, because this was a well-known story in business circles, a miracle turnaround that had become legend, and I turned to my husband, squeezed his hand, and said, "That consultant was him." And the room erupted in gasps, because the so-called idiot standing beside me was the quiet genius who had rescued an empire without ever taking credit, without asking for a penny, because he believed in helping people, not owning them. And I watched as his father-in-law staggered back into his chair, mouth opening and closing like he wanted to deny it but couldn't, because the paperwork, the signatures, the late-night emails all existed, locked away in files my husband had never bothered to destroy. And I added softly, "He asked for one thing in return, that your family never know," because he didn't want respect born from fear or obligation. And at that point the bride's mother covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face, while the bride herself looked at my husband with a mixture of shock and pride she had never felt before. And I finished by saying, "So yes, you may call him an idiot if you like, but everything you stand on was built by his so-called stupidity." And when I handed the microphone back, the hall was dead silent until one person began to clap, then another, and soon the applause was thunderous, not the polite kind, but the kind that shakes walls, and my husband stood there overwhelmed, because he had never wanted recognition, yet in that moment he finally received something far more valuable than praise, truth. And as for his father-in-law, he left the wedding early, shoulders hunched, his power shattered not by anger or revenge, but by a secret revealed at exactly the right time, while my husband and I danced under the lights. Knowing that sometimes dignity isn't about staying silent, it's about choosing the moment when silence is no longer deserved. After that night, when the music faded and the guests drifted away still whispering my husband's name with a new kind of reverence, we thought the story would end there, that the truth had been spoken, and we could finally return to our quiet life. But power humiliated rarely stays silent. And within days the shockwaves began to ripple outward, because his father-in-law was not a man accustomed to being exposed, let alone in front of the very people whose admiration fed his ego, and the first sign came as a carefully worded phone call requesting a private conversation, which my husband declined with the same calm politeness that had always infuriated that man, followed by a sudden shift in tone as business partners began calling, not to congratulate, but to probe, to ask pointed questions about old deals, old restructurings, and whether certain decisions had been influenced by an unnamed benefactor. And I watched my husband read those emails late at night, his face unreadable, because the secret he had kept to protect others was now unraveling threads he never meant to pull. And yet he refused to panic, reminding me that truth, once released, cannot be controlled, only faced. But his father In-law chose a different path, one of quiet retaliation, leaking selective information to the press, framing the anonymous consultant not as a savior, but as a manipulator, suggesting conflicts of interest where none existed, and soon headlines appeared hinting at scandals that never happened, trying to recast generosity as greed, intelligence as deceit, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw my husband hesitate, not because he feared losing reputation or money, but because he feared that the thousands of people whose jobs he had saved might now feel betrayed, and that was when I realized the cruelty of pride, how it seeks not just to wound the person who exposed it, but to poison everything they ever touched. And so, when a formal inquiry was announced, summoning my husband to testify about events long buried, I expected anger, frustration, but instead he surprised me by smiling sadly and saying, "Maybe it's time the whole truth comes out." And those words carried a weight that frightened me more than any threat, because I knew he was done hiding, and at the hearing, as lawyers circled him like vultures hoping to provoke a slip, he spoke with the same quiet clarity that had once saved an empire, laying out facts, timelines, emails, and decisions with surgical precision, never blaming, never boasting, simply explaining. And as the hours passed, the narrative his father-in-law had tried to construct collapsed under its own contradictions, because lies require constant maintenance, while truth stands on its own, and by the end of the day, it was clear to everyone in that room who had acted out of greed and who had acted out of principle. And when the final report was released weeks later, it didn't just clear my husband's name, it exposed a pattern of arrogance and coercion that reached far beyond one insult at a wedding, implicating executives who had long relied on fear to maintain control, and the fallout was swift. Contracts were frozen, boards were reshuffled, resignations announced in terse statements filled with hollow regret, and the man who once called my husband an idiot retreated from public view entirely, his empire shrinking as quickly as his influence, while my husband, ironically, was offered positions, honors, and interviews he had never sought, all of which he declined, choosing instead to establish a foundation that quietly supported struggling businesses and protected workers from the very kind of exploitation he had just witnessed exposed. And one evening, months later, as we sat together watching the city lights flicker below our window, he finally admitted that the wedding insult had hurt more than he ever let on, not because of pride, but because it came from someone who was supposed to become family, and I told him that perhaps family, like respect, is not defined by blood or titles, but by how people behave when they believe no one is watching. And as he leaned his head against my shoulder, I understood that the secret I had revealed that night did more than shatter one man's arrogance. It marked the end of a chapter defined by silence and the beginning of one shaped by accountability, where dignity was no longer hidden in the shadows, but allowed to stand openly, unafraid of who might be offended by its light. By the time a full year had passed since that wedding, life had settled into a strange new normal that neither of us could have predicted, because while the world saw my husband as a symbol of integrity and quiet brilliance, we were still learning how to live with the consequences of truth spoken too loudly to ever be taken back. And it was during that uneasy calm that the final reckoning arrived, not with anger or accusations, but with desperation, when one rainy evening there was a knock at our door, and standing there, older, thinner, and stripped of every trace of authority, was his father-in-law, the man who had once filled rooms with fear using nothing more than his name, now clutching a worn coat and asking if he could come in. And I felt my body tense as memories of that insult echoed in my mind. But my husband, after a long pause, stepped aside and let him enter, because despite everything, cruelty had never taken root in his heart, and as the man sat across from us, hands trembling, he finally spoke without an audience to impress, confessing that after the inquiry, after the resignations and financial losses, people he once controlled had vanished, alliances had evaporated, and for the first time in his life he was alone with the weight of his own actions, admitting in a broken voice that calling my husband an idiot that night had been less about contempt and more about fear. Fear that the quiet man beside his daughter possessed something he never could, a strength that did not rely on intimidation or applause, and as the confession spilled out, I realized this visit was not about forgiveness, but survival, because he asked my husband for help, not money or power, but guidance, saying he no longer knew how to exist without dominance, and the room fell silent as my husband listened, his expression unreadable before he finally spoke, not with triumph, but with honesty, telling him that intelligence without humility rots, that success built on fear collapses the moment fear disappears, and that if he truly wanted to change, it would begin with accepting insignificance, with learning to contribute without being recognized, words that seemed to wound more deeply than any accusation, because they stripped away the illusion that redemption could be negotiated like a deal. And when the man left that night, shoulders bowed, I did not know whether he would ever return, but weeks later we learned he had sold what remained of his holdings and volunteered anonymously with organizations supporting workers he once exploited. A quiet penance no headline would ever praise, and watching this unfold, I understood that the secret revealed at the wedding had not just shattered arrogance, it had forced a man to confront the emptiness beneath it, while for my husband the journey took a different turn, as the foundation he created began changing lives in small, meaningful ways, saving family businesses, protecting employees, restoring dignity where it had been stolen. And one evening, as we attended a modest gathering of people he had helped, no cameras, no speeches, just gratitude expressed in tired smiles and firm handshakes, I saw him glow with a fulfillment no award could ever provide, and later that night he told me he finally understood why fate had chosen that painful moment at the wedding, because if the insult had never been spoken, the truth might have remained buried, and the damage caused by unchecked power would have continued unseen. And as I looked at the man I loved, I realized that some secrets are not meant to be kept forever, that sometimes they exist only until the moment they can dismantle cruelty, restore balance, and remind everyone watching that real intelligence is not loud, real strength does not humiliate, and real victory is not watching someone fall, but witnessing what rises in the space that arrogance once occupied. Years later, when people spoke about that wedding, it was no longer as gossip or scandal, but as the quiet turning point that changed many lives in ways no one could have predicted, because time has a way of sanding down drama and leaving only truth behind. And by then, my husband's foundation had grown into something almost invisible yet immensely powerful, operating without his name on the front, supporting ethical businesses, mentoring young professionals who had been told they were not smart enough, not connected enough, or simply idiots, by people who mistook volume for intelligence, and I often watched him late at night reviewing proposals with the same patience he had always shown, knowing that every decision he made was guided not by revenge or pride, but by a deep understanding of what humiliation can do to a human soul. And it was during one of those quiet nights that we received a letter written in an unsteady hand, no return address, only a few pages filled with raw honesty, and I knew before he said a word who it was from, because the tone carried the weight of a man who had lost everything except the chance to finally see himself clearly. And as my husband read it aloud, the letter spoke of loneliness, of volunteering in silence, of learning how to listen instead of command, and of a regret that no apology could erase but still demanded to be acknowledged, ending with a simple line that said, "I finally understand what an idiot truly is, and it was never you." And when my husband folded the letter and placed it carefully in a drawer, I asked him if he felt relief, and he shook his head and said he felt responsibility, because understanding, once gained, carries an obligation to do better, and that sentence stayed with me, echoing through the years as we watched the world continue its noisy obsession with dominance, status, and humiliation disguised as humor, while quietly, steadily, lives were being rebuilt through choices rooted in dignity. And eventually our own children grew old enough to ask about that famous wedding they had heard whispered about, and instead of telling them about insults or shattered empires, we told them about silence, about restraint, about how true power reveals itself when you refuse to use it to crush others. And on our anniversary, standing in the same city where it had all begun, my husband looked at me and said that the greatest gift I had ever given him was not defending him that night, but believing that the truth deserved air even when it would complicate our lives, and I realized then that the story was never really about a father-in-law or a cruel word spoken into a microphone. It was about what happens when dignity finally refuses to stay hidden, when kindness stands its ground, and when a single moment of courage ripples outward across years, reshaping not just reputations, but character itself, leaving behind a legacy no insult could ever diminish. As the decades quietly unfolded after that turning point, the story continued to grow not louder but deeper, threading itself into places no headline or rumor could ever reach. Because legacy is not built in moments of spectacle, but in the accumulation of small, consistent choices, and my husband's work, still deliberately anonymous, began influencing policies, ethical frameworks, and business cultures in ways even he did not fully see, as people he had mentored went on to lead companies with compassion instead of cruelty, breaking cycles they themselves had once been trapped in, and sometimes one of them would sit across from us at a modest dinner table and confess that they had nearly become like the man who once called my husband an idiot, until a single conversation redirected them, and every time I heard those words, I thought back to that wedding and understood that humiliation, when left unchallenged, multiplies. But when exposed to truth, it loses its power to reproduce, and age softened us too, not into passivity, but into clarity, because with time my husband finally allowed himself to feel the pain he had buried for so long, admitting one evening that being underestimated had shaped his silence as much as his humility, and that learning to speak, even when his voice shook, had been the hardest lesson of all. And I realized that while I had revealed his secret that night to protect his dignity, the years that followed were teaching him to protect it himself. And then one winter we received news that his former father-in-law had passed away quietly, without ceremony, without recognition, and for a long time my husband said nothing, until finally he lit a candle and said he hoped the man had found peace, a gesture that surprised even me. But in that moment I understood forgiveness not as absolution, but as release, a refusal to carry someone else's bitterness into the future, and standing there, watching the flame flicker, I felt the final weight of that insult lift from our lives, because it no longer defined any part of our story, and as our children grew, choosing paths shaped by empathy rather than entitlement, they inherited not wealth or status but an unspoken code of conduct, one that valued integrity over applause, and sometimes, when asked why we never corrected people who misjudged us, my husband would smile and say that truth does not need a microphone unless silence becomes injustice. And looking back now, I see that the secret revealed at the wedding was only the first crack in a much larger wall, one that separated power from accountability, pride from purpose, and fear from respect, and what emerged through that opening was not revenge or triumph, but a quieter revolution, one where dignity learned to stand upright, intelligence learned to speak without shouting, and kindness proved itself stronger than humiliation, leaving behind a legacy measured not in empires or applause, but in lives permanently altered by the simple courage to reveal the truth at exactly the moment it could no longer be ignored. In the final years, when life slowed and the world around us felt both smaller and more honest, the meaning of everything that had begun with a single cruel word at a wedding finally settled into something clear and enduring, because by then the people most affected by that moment no longer remembered the insult itself, but the transformation that followed it. And as my husband and I sat together in the quiet mornings, watching sunlight move across the floor, he often reflected on how strange it was that the most humiliating moment of his life had become the doorway to its greatest purpose, and I understood then that stories do not end when conflicts resolve. They end when understanding takes root, and one afternoon, long after his foundation had outlived any need for his guidance, a young man visited us, nervous and unsure, carrying the familiar weight of being dismissed as insignificant, and he told my husband that someone powerful had called him an idiot in front of others, expecting laughter and obedience, and my husband listened silently before answering with words shaped by a lifetime of restraint and courage, telling him that intelligence is not proven by domination, that dignity is not granted by approval, and that the truest response to humiliation is not rage but purpose. And after the young man left with renewed resolve, my husband turned to me and said softly that the circle finally felt complete because what had once wounded him was now healing others, and when his own strength eventually began to fade, he asked for no speeches, no honors, only that we continue living quietly, and when the end came, it arrived without spectacle, surrounded by family, grounded in peace, and in days that followed, messages came not from the powerful, but from ordinary people whose lives had been steadied by his unseen hand, each one a testament to the idea that real greatness leaves footprints rather than monuments, and standing there, holding the memories of a lifetime shaped by a single moment of truth, I realized that the secret revealed at that wedding did not shatter a family or an empire in the end. It shattered an illusion, the dangerous belief that worth can be measured by volume, titles, or fear. And what remained after that illusion fell was something far more durable. A legacy of integrity passed quietly from one person to another, proving that even when someone tries to reduce you with a word meant to humiliate, the most powerful response is to live so truthfully that their cruelty becomes irrelevant. And as I tell this story now, not as a defense or a warning, but as a reflection, I know with certainty that dignity once claimed cannot be taken away, and that sometimes the bravest act is not exposing a secret, but allowing the truth it reveals to guide a lifetime of quiet, unshakable purpose.